Welcome back, folks. This is Kellen McGovern Jones coming at you straight from Cowtown. This is Cowtown Caller. Today, we're doing a deep dive prediction episode on the Supreme Court's upcoming decision in Trump versus Barbara, which should drop any day now. Typically, you get the big Supreme Court decisions on Thursdays, so we should expect the opinion by the end of the week. And we know we have to get it this week, maybe in the first few days and next week, but most likely this week, because the Supreme Court gavels out in the first few days of July, and we're there. At the time of this recording, this is June 28th, so the opinion is imminent. Now, here's a quick recap for new listeners. President Trump, immediately after returning to office in January 2025, handed down an executive order clarifying the federal understanding of birthright citizenship. The order directed the federal agencies to not treat people born in the U.S. to illegal aliens or people born in the U.S. to people with temporary visa status, such as an H-1B visa, as citizens. And the executive order took effect in February of 2025. So it was not retrospective. It was only for current or new births. The case is named after, quote unquote, Barbara, a Honduran asylum seeker whose child was due to be born in late 2025, in October 2025. Lower courts immediately blocked the order, and the Supreme Court finally announced that they would hear oral arguments on it, and they did on April 1st of this year. And we've been waiting for the opinion ever since. So, what happened at oral arguments? The big debate centered on the meaning of, quote, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, end quote, in the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment. Solicitor General John Sauer, who's the lawyer for the government, argued that the phrase has always carried a narrow meaning, requiring not just physical presence in the US, but some real allegiance or permanent connection to the United States. He pointed to several historical exceptions, such as children of foreign-born ambassadors or children born during a hostile invasion of US soil. But Celia Wang argued for the challengers. She's the ACLU lady. She argued for the challengers, and they pushed back pretty hard. She said that those narrow exceptions, such as ambassadors, invading armies, blah, 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 are a closed set. So that's just a few exceptions, those and others, and they do not establish a broader principle to cover illegal immigrants or parents without permanent legal status. Of course, the government disagreed, and they went back and forth in the oral arguments, with the government arguing that if the parents owe primary allegiance elsewhere and aren't fully subject to U.S. sovereign authority in the constitutional sense of the term, their children born here don't automatically get citizenship. Now, the justices went back and forth. The Supreme Court justices went back and forth as to what the framers of the 14th Amendment and the Citizenship Clause meant. And then, of course, there was the case of Wong Kim Ark, a previous Supreme Court case, and really the only Supreme Court case to ever come close to what's being argued today. Wong Kim Ark was a case from around the turn of the century. It was in 1898, and the Supreme Court ruled in that case 6-2 that a man born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrant parents who were on a precursor to the green card, so they had permanent legal status, that Wong Kim Ark was a citizen despite the fact that his parents were not citizens. He was born on U.S. soil. His parents had legal status. Wong Kim Ark was a citizen. And the court held that the 14th Amendment's citizenship guarantee applies broadly to nearly everyone born here with permanent legal status, whose parents have permanent legal status. So that was the foundational precedent for birthright citizenship over the last 125 years. The Supreme Court in that case never covered whether the children of illegal aliens would be citizens, and they never covered whether the children of people with temporary status that could maybe last less than a year, would be citizens. So there's also another legal question the court is having to address here, aside from those. There's a smaller question. I don't think this is as important, but all the legal podcasters are hung up on this, so I'll tell you what it is. But there's a side question about whether the president, through an executive order, can even, quote unquote, determine who citizens are or aren't. And you hear advisory opinions. That's David French and Sarah Isgur Flores's podcast, which is totally insufferable. It's like the worst legal podcast. They have a monopoly because they're the only people that do what they do, but it's unbearable. It's like, it's so bad. Their legal takes can be so bad, and they're so inconsistent, and a little bit high on their own supply. But they make the argument that's somehow gotten into the ether that the president cannot do this through executive order. I argue that, of course, the president can determine or can direct the federal agencies to treat people as citizens or not citizens, because they either are citizens or they are not. If the Supreme Court finds that these people are not citizens, then the president has every authority to treat people who are not citizens as not citizens. But if they are citizens, then the Supreme Court should have no problem striking this down. It's a very silly legal argument, but it's in the ether, and I thought I would address it right there. So that's what's being debated at the Supreme Court. What's my prediction? This is unorthodox. This is a little outre, but I think Trump is victorious at some level. Now, I don't think the Supreme Court is going to strike down. Here's why. I don't think the Supreme Court is going to strike down the president's entire economic agenda by striking down the tariffs earlier this year, and his entire domestic agenda by striking down his signature policy on immigration in the same term. That would be way too much, way too fast, especially with Chief Justice John Roberts on the court. Roberts is very defensive of the perception of the court's impartiality and the perception of the court's independence. And I think doing all of that would threaten the idea of the court's impartiality and probably a little bit independence, because you're going to have some conservatives that, if this case is lost, some on the right wing are going to argue for packing the court, like the left has been doing for the last few years. I don't see Roberts being this provocative to all political sides. And here's why. You may remember back in the middle 2010s, like 2015, 16, 17, after Justice Scalia died, the Justice Roberts was very sensitive to deciding any big legal questions when there wasn't a full bench of the Supreme Court meeting to decide the legal questions. And so he held off a lot of big decisions. He would flip his opinion on certain decisions, so it would split the court, and then there would be no big rulings. Be 4-4. He'd move around. There was more swing votes on the court at the time, but he would move around his vote so that the court would be split and big legal decisions would be held off until eventually Neil Gorsuch was appointed to succeed Scalia. So he was very sensitive to the perception of the court. And in Dobbs, Dobbs, of course, being the case that overturned Roe versus Wade, Roberts didn't fully agree with the majority in that case. He dissented on some elements. And I think, in my opinion, the reason the Chief Justice did that was so that this would not look like a 6-3 steamrolling of the liberals on the Supreme Court. But nevertheless, there was an argument made by some on the political left in the country that Justice Roberts and the current Supreme Court were a rubber stamp for whatever Republicans wanted. If they wanted it, they were going to get it. Justice Roberts was going to deliver it. And then earlier this year, Justice Roberts joined the majority in joined the majority that was partly formed with liberals in striking down the tariffs, President Trump's tariffs after he'd returned to office. And now you really can't make that argument anymore that the Supreme Court isn't independent. That certainly, I mean, three members of the court, Barrett, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, were appointed by Trump, but yet, the Supreme Court is still striking down some of Trump's biggest policy decisions. So you cannot make the argument that the Supreme Court is not independent anymore. No one arguing in good faith could argue that. So what I see out of Roberts is there's a political sensitivity in him. He is aware of the perceptions of the court, and he does act with those in mind, which leads me to my conclusion that either him or Barrett I think one of them will dissent and one of them will join the majority, probably even write the majority opinion in this case, and it will be in favor of the president to some degree. And there's different ways they could do this. They could give the president a sweeping victory here and give him everything. They may go through individual classes of aliens, and they'll say, okay, the children of illegal aliens are clearly not citizens, but the children of F1 student visa holders are, or something like that. I'm not saying that specifically, but it could be some sort of concession to one side and victory on for the other. There could be something like that. In any event, I think that Roberts is going to deliver a victory for the president here. No one else agrees with me. But what I'll say is, remember when Paula Jones was suing Bill Clinton back in the 90s, okay? And all of the legal beagles, all of the big political minds were saying, oh, the Supreme Court, Paula Jones doesn't have a chance. She doesn't have a chance. Everyone agreed, except for maybe Ann Coulter, that Paula Jones was totally screwed, okay? And no pun intended. And that at best, they were going to split the baby and end up saying that, oh, you can sue President Clinton, but not when he's in office. And then Paula Jones won. So these legal beagles who claim to know everything in the media, probably the ones you've been hearing about, don't always know everything. And you know what? If I'm wrong here, that could end up including me. But this is my prediction. I think that President Trump either gets a 5-4 victory, possibly 6-3, but I'm thinking 5-4. Now, there's one thing here which I don't know how to make heads or tails of, but I'll point it out to you because I think there will be some significance to this. The Supreme Court is waiting until the very end of the term to release this decision. That could mean a couple of things. We know from previous leaks at the Supreme Court that sometimes the justices wait to release their decisions. Like the majority, let's say it's a 5-4 case, the majority will decide what the ruling is going to be. The 5-person majority, they put their opinion together. And then the 4 dissenting justices, some of them or all of them, will circulate several drafts of their opinions, or they'll wait before they return their final opinion because they don't like what the majority ruling is going to be, and so they hold off. They hold off on returning their opinion just to delay. I think that could be one thing. It could also be that the Supreme Court is making the typical political media calculation that a lot of organizations do, that whenever they're going to do something that's going to be very controversial, and by the way, this is going to be very controversial. Half of the country is going to be outraged about this, probably, no matter what the outcome is. They wait to release something controversial until right before a holiday weekend. So people are kind of distracted. It's the 4th of July is right upon us. I think the 4th of July is on Saturday. So people are going to, already be off with their kids on a boat to the beach, wherever, lighting off fireworks. And so it mitigates some of the outrage that'll happen from either side whenever this opinion is released. So that could cut either way. You could read that either way. So I'm just pointing that out because there is some significance of it to that, but we won't know what it is until after the opinion's released. What does this mean going forward? No matter how this works out, Trump versus Barbara will be the biggest constitutional rights case of our lifetime. Full stop. And whichever way it goes, the legal battles are far from over. If Trump is victorious, he or a future president in the same vein could follow up with another executive order trying to make the denial of citizenship retroactive for the same class of aliens, but in the past. Because you got to remember the current executive order only applies to aliens, children of aliens born during Trump's current term. So the next executive order would have to be retrospective. And the Supreme Court even contemplated this in oral arguments. And they went back and forth about, okay, like if we give the president this power, or we uphold the executive order for the current aliens, of course, if the same legal question is brought before us for past aliens, like we're going to have to give it to them too. So the Supreme Court has already contemplated this. So there will probably be another case on something very similar to this in the very near future if Trump wins. If he loses, this becomes the new Roe versus Wade. And by that I mean it's a decades long political and legal flashpoint. It'll shape court nominations, confirmation fights, state level legislation for a generation or more. And you'll see legal scholars and activists on both sides working overtime to shift or defend the prevailing understanding of the 14th Amendment, just like we saw after Roe. Either outcome keeps this issue alive in some manner for many years. And that's my read, folks. I'm not hedging. I think Trump gets a meaningful win here because the court isn't going to blow up his economic and immigration agendas in one term. And Roberts, I mean, he just said a few months ago he's leaving the Supreme Court feet first. So he's not leaving till he dies. Roberts is playing the long game here, and he's playing the long game on the court's institutional power. What do you think? Drop your predictions in the comments. I would love to hear them. You can also find me at Cowtown Caller on Twitter. And you can also respond. I think you can respond. Some of y'all do sometimes to these emails. So if you're one of the readers that gets the podcast and the newsletter to your email, respond to it. I read every single comment, no matter where it comes through. And I try to respond to all of them. So this is Kellen McGovern Jones. Stay sharp. Stay informed, folks. Stay engaged, and I'll talk to you soon. And happy 4th of July.